Part 1, The Broken Palace. Emperor Vorthan sat on his massive obsidian throne, staring out at the vast empire he ruled with an iron claw. But if anyone looked closely at his dark purple scales, they would notice they had lost their shine. 3 years had passed since his beloved mate died, and the grief still clung to him like a heavy shadow. The great dragon emperor who commanded fleets across a dozen star systems couldn't command the emptiness in his own heart. His real worry, though, wasn't himself. It was his son. Prince Ashrik was 10 years old in human terms, though dragons age differently. The young prince was brilliant beyond measure. He could solve mathematical equations that stumped the imperial scholars. He understood quantum physics better than most adults. His mind worked in ways that amazed everyone who taught him. But there was something else about Ashrik that the court didn't understand, something they whispered about when they thought no one was listening. The palace was a nightmare for the young prince. The enormous halls carried sounds that bounced off the walls for what seemed like forever. Every footstep echoed. Every voice multiplied. The ceremonial fires that burned in the great chambers were so bright they hurt to look at. The constant demands from tutors, advisors, and nobles expecting him to behave in exact, specific ways pressed down on him like a physical weight. When it all became too much, Ashrik would have what the court called episodes. His body would shake. He would cover his ear slits with his claws and curl into himself. Sometimes he would cry out or lash his tail. The nobles talked about it in hushed tones behind closed doors. They said the prince was weak. They said the imperial bloodline was damaged. They said he would never be fit to rule. Vorthan heard these whispers, and they tore at him. He loved his son fiercely, but he didn't know how to help him. Every advisor he consulted gave the same advice: be stricter, demand more discipline, force the prince to adapt. But Vorthan could see that approach only made things worse. His son was struggling, and the emperor felt powerless for the first time in his long life. Then the human tribute arrived. The Draconic Imperium had recently expanded into human space, bringing several Earth colonies under dragon rule. As was tradition, the conquered world sent servants to the imperial palace as a sign of respect and submission. These humans were small and fragile compared to dragons. They lived for maybe 80 or 90 years if they were lucky, while dragons lived for centuries. Most of the dragon court barely noticed them, seeing them as temporary fixtures that would be gone in the blink of an eye. A group of 20 humans arrived on a transport ship, all of them visibly terrified. They had heard stories about dragons, about their size and strength and the heat of their breath. They stood in the reception hall with their heads bowed, waiting to be assigned their duties. Vorthan sat on his throne during the ceremony, his mind elsewhere. He approved the assignments with barely a glance. But one human stepped forward. Her name was Katie Mitchell, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and calm brown eyes that didn't show the fear the others did. She spoke directly to the head chamberlain, a pompous old dragon named Thex who managed the palace staff. "I'd like to request assignment to Prince Ashrik's wing," Katie said clearly. The entire hall went silent. Thex's scales rippled with surprise and then amusement. Several dragons in attendance made sounds that were the dragon equivalent of laughing. The idea of a human, especially one who had just arrived, requesting a specific assignment was absurd. More than that, she wanted to work with the prince, the one role that required the utmost trust and discretion. "And why?" Thex asked with barely concealed mockery. "Would you presume to be suitable for such a position?" Katie didn't flinch. "Because I worked with children like the prince back on Earth. Children who see and feel the world differently. Children who everyone else had given up on. I helped them. I can help him too." The chamber erupted in offended hisses and growls. How dare this human suggest that the imperial prince needed help from someone like her? Thex was about to dismiss her outright when Vorthan's voice cut through the noise. Silence. Every dragon in the room froze. The emperor leaned forward on his throne, his golden eyes fixed on this small human who had just spoken with more confidence than most of his own advisors ever showed. "You claim you can help my son?" Vorthan's voice was dangerous and quiet. Katie met his gaze. Most humans couldn't maintain eye contact with a dragon, especially not an emperor. But she did. "I can try, Your Majesty. I can't promise miracles, but I know children who struggle with what your son struggles with. I've seen them succeed when given the right support." Something in her voice caught Vorthan's attention. It wasn't arrogance. It was genuine belief. This human actually thought she could do something that dozens of dragon experts had failed to do. He should have dismissed her. Every reasonable part of his mind said to send her to work in the kitchens or the gardens like the other humans. But he was desperate. And desperate fathers take chances they normally wouldn't. "Fine, Vorthan said. You have 1 week. If my son shows any improvement, you may continue. If not, you'll be reassigned. Thex looked shocked, but he bowed his head and agreed. The other dragons muttered among themselves. And Katie simply nodded once, accepting the challenge. That afternoon, Katie was brought to Prince Ashrik's quarters in the eastern wing of the palace. The guards opened the heavy doors and gestured for her to enter. The room beyond was dark. All the glowstones had been dimmed or covered. In the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a shape huddled against the wall. Prince Ashrik had his claws pressed against the sides of his head where his ears were. His wings were wrapped tight around his body. He was shaking slightly, and Katie could hear small distress sounds coming from him. The guard started to speak loudly, to announce her presence, but Katie quickly put a finger to her lips and waved him away. She stepped into the room alone and quietly closed the door behind her. Then she did something no one expected. She didn't approach the prince. She didn't try to talk to him or touch him or make demands. She simply walked to the opposite corner of the room, sat down on the floor, and began to hum. It was a soft, low sound, rhythmic and predictable. A simple tune her own mother used to hum to her when she was upset. Hours passed. Katie didn't move except to shift her weight occasionally. She kept humming the same gentle melody. And slowly, very slowly, the shaking form in the corner began to still. Katie Mitchell spent her first few weeks doing something that no one in the Imperial Palace had ever thought to do. She watched. She listened. She paid attention to the smallest details of Prince Ashrik's behavior, tracking patterns that everyone else had dismissed as random or meaningless. She noticed that every morning around the same time, Ashrik would press his claws against his ear slits and retreat to the darkest corner of his room. At first, she couldn't figure out why. Then she realized it was exactly when the palace guards changed shifts in the hallway outside. The dragons would call out to each other in their formal speech, using high-pitched harmonics that were traditional for military protocol. To most dragons, these sounds were normal, even pleasant. But to Ashrik, they were like knives scraping inside his head. Katie started speaking to him only in low, calm tones. She avoided the sharp, high-frequency sounds that dragons typically used for important conversations. And something amazing happened. Ashrik actually responded. He would turn his head toward her when she spoke. His body would relax instead of tensing up. It was a small thing, but it was progress. She discovered more patterns as the days went by. Ashrik did better in the early morning when the palace was quieter. He could focus on tasks for about 20 minutes before his attention started to scatter and he'd become frustrated. He hated sudden changes but thrived when he knew exactly what was coming next. Bright lights made him agitated, but soft, dim lighting helped him stay calm. He didn't like being touched unexpectedly, but he seemed to crave a certain kind of firm, steady pressure. Armed with this knowledge, Katie began to build something the prince had never had before, a routine he could actually handle. Every morning, she would arrive at his quarters at exactly the same time. Not a minute early, not a minute late. Ashrik began to anticipate her arrival, and that predictability seemed to comfort him. She would greet him in the same way each day, with the same low tone and the same simple words. Then they would walk together to a small garden alcove on the eastern side of the palace. This garden was one of Katie's first victories. She had requested it specifically, and after some resistance, the palace staff had agreed. It was enclosed and quiet, protected from the echoing sounds of the main halls. Plants from a dozen different worlds grew there, but Katie had made sure none of them had strong scents that might overwhelm Ashrik's sensitive nose. A small fountain provided a gentle, constant sound of running water. It was predictable white noise that seemed to help the prince concentrate. There, in that peaceful space, Katie would read to Ashrik. She chose books about mathematics, physics, and astronomy, subjects that fascinated him. But she read in her calm, low voice, and she let him look away or fidget or pace if he needed to. She never demanded eye contact. She never insisted he sit still. And slowly, day by day, Ashrik began to engage more. After the morning reading session, they would return to his study chamber for lessons. But Katie had changed how those lessons worked. Instead of the traditional 3-hour blocks that the dragon tutors insisted on, she broke everything into 20-minute segments. 20 minutes of focus, then a 5-minute break where Ashrik could do whatever he needed to do. He might pace around the room, or hum to himself, or simply sit in silence. Katie didn't judge or try to rush him. When the 5 minutes were up, they would return to the lesson. The other tutors thought this was ridiculous. They complained that it disrupted the flow of learning, that it was coddling the prince, that he needed to build discipline and endurance. But Katie stood her ground, and Emperor Vorthan, watching from a distance, allowed her to continue. The results spoke for themselves. Within 3 weeks, Ashrik was completing more work in his shorter, broken-up study sessions than he ever had during the long, exhausting traditional lessons. His mathematics scores improved dramatically. He began to show interest in stellar navigation, creating complex route calculations that impressed even the master navigators. One of Katie's most successful innovations was something she introduced in the second month. She had noticed that Ashrik often wrapped his wings tightly around himself or pressed his body into corners. He seemed to be seeking pressure, a feeling of being held or compressed. In dragon culture, this was seen as babyish behavior, something young hatchlings did. Ashrik had been scolded for it countless times. But Katie understood what it really was. Back on Earth, she had worked with children who needed the same thing. She spoke with the palace engineers and described what she needed. They looked at her like she was crazy, but they built it anyway. The result was a blanket unlike anything the dragons had ever seen. It was woven from thermal chain mesh, a material usually used in ship construction. The blanket was heavy, weighing about 30 pounds in Earth gravity. When draped over Ashrik's body, it provided firm, even pressure across his back and sides. The first time Katie introduced it, Ashrik's eyes went wide. He pulled the blanket around himself, and for the first time since she had met him, he smiled. Really smiled. He kept that blanket with him constantly after that, dragging it from room to room. The court nobles made jokes about the prince and his security blanket, but Katie didn't care. Ashrik was calmer, more focused, and happier. Perhaps her most important contribution was teaching Ashrik an alternative way to communicate. She had noticed that sometimes, especially when he was stressed or overwhelmed, speaking became difficult for him. His voice would lock up in his throat. Words that he clearly knew wouldn't come out. He would become frustrated, and that frustration would spiral into panic. Katie taught him sign language. Not dragon sign language, which was complicated and formal, but human sign language, which was simpler and more intuitive. She showed him basic signs first. Yes. No. Stop. Break. Help. Then they expanded from there. Ashrik took to it immediately. When speaking felt impossible, he could sign instead. When the sensory input of the world became too much and he needed everything to stop, he could make the sign, and Katie would understand. He didn't have to force words out. He didn't have to pretend to be okay when he wasn't. The transformation was remarkable. Within 2 months, Prince Ashrik was attending group lessons with other young dragons. He was participating in court functions, standing beside his father during important ceremonies. He still needed his accommodations, the dim lighting, the quiet spaces, the regular breaks, but he was functioning in ways that everyone had thought impossible. The court watched in amazement. Some of them began to whisper that Katie had worked some kind of human magic. Others suggested she had given the prince special medicines or used advanced technology from Earth. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any of that. Katie had simply listened. She had paid attention to what Ashrik needed instead of forcing him to fit into what everyone else expected. She had treated his differences not as flaws to be corrected, but as traits to be understood and accommodated. And Emperor Vorthan noticed everything. He watched from the shadows of the palace, seeing his son laugh for the first time in years. He watched Katie deflect cruel comments from visiting nobles with quiet strength. He watched her celebrate every tiny victory, 3 seconds of eye contact, a sentence spoken in front of strangers, a full hour in a crowded room, like they were the greatest achievements in the world. Something in the emperor's chest began to warm, like cold metal slowly heated by a flame. For the first time since his mate's death, Vorthan felt something other than grief and worry. He felt hope. And something else he wasn't quite ready to name. The announcement came on a cold morning when frost covered the palace windows. The Grand Conclave would be held in 6 weeks. Every major draconic house across the empire would send representatives. It was the most important gathering in a generation, and Prince Ashrik was expected to be presented as the official heir to the throne. Katie felt her stomach drop when she heard the news. She had been working with Ashrik for nearly 4 months, and yes, he had made incredible progress. But the Grand Conclave was something else entirely. It wasn't a quiet garden or a dimly lit study room. It was a spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses, to demonstrate power and tradition through sheer sensory force. She immediately requested a meeting with the emperor's advisors to discuss accommodations. She was met with stone-faced resistance. "The Grand Conclave has been conducted the same way for 3,000 years, said Lord Dravik, the head of the Imperial Council. His grey scales were marked with scars from a dozen wars. We will not change sacred traditions because a human servant thinks the prince needs special treatment. Katie kept her voice calm, though anger simmered beneath the surface. I'm not asking you to change the entire ceremony. I'm asking for small adjustments. Let Ashrik stand in a less crowded section. Reduce the brightness of the ceremonial flames near where he'll be positioned. Give him breaks between the different segments. Absolutely not, another advisor snapped. The other houses are already whispering that our prince is weak. If we make accommodations, it will confirm their suspicions. He must perform like any other heir, or he should not be presented at all. Katie turned to Emperor Vorthan, who sat silently at the head of the table. His golden eyes were troubled, but he said nothing. The advisors took his silence as agreement, and the meeting was dismissed. Over the next 6 weeks, Katie did everything she could to prepare Ashrik. She described what the ceremony would be like in detail, going over it again and again so there would be no surprises. She practiced with him in increasingly crowded and loud environments, gradually building up his tolerance. She taught him grounding techniques, ways to focus his mind when everything around him became chaos. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be enough. The Grand Conclave wasn't just loud or crowded. It was an assault on every sense simultaneously, designed specifically to be overwhelming. And Ashrik, despite all his progress, still had limits. The day of the ceremony arrived. The great ceremonial hall had been transformed into something that belonged in legends. Hundreds of dragons filled the space, each wearing elaborate armor that caught and reflected the light. Their scales gleamed in colors that ranged from deep crimson to brilliant gold to midnight black. The ceiling had been opened to the sky, and columns of flame shot upward at regular intervals, roaring like caged thunder. Drums the size of small buildings pounded out a rhythm that you could feel in your bones. Katie stood in the section reserved for palace staff, far from where Ashrik would be positioned. She had requested to stay near him, to be someone familiar he could look at if he needed grounding. Her request had been denied. The advisor said it would look weak if the prince needed a human servant standing beside him during such an important ceremony. Prince Ashrik entered the hall with his father. Even from a distance, Katie could see the tension in his body. His wings were held too tight against his back. His claws were flexing and unflexing, a nervous habit she recognized. But he was trying. He was trying so hard to be what everyone expected him to be. The ceremony began with the traditional declarations. Each house announced themselves with thunderous voices that echoed off the stone walls. The drums grew louder. More flames erupted from braziers placed throughout the hall. The temperature rose steadily as hundreds of dragons breathed small jets of fire in ritualistic patterns. The air filled with smoke and the sharp scent of burning metals used in the ceremonial flames. Katie watched Ashrik, and her heart sank. She could see him starting to shut down. His eyes were going unfocused. His breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. He was being asked to stand perfectly still in the center of a nightmare, surrounded by everything that his mind and body couldn't handle, and there was nothing she could do to help him. 4 minutes into the ceremony, Ashrik began to rock slightly from side to side. The dragons near him noticed and whispered to each other. 6 minutes in, he pressed his claws against his ear slits, trying to block out the overwhelming sound. The whispers grew louder. This was not how an imperial heir was supposed to behave. At 7 minutes, something inside Ashrik broke. It started with a sound, a high-pitched keen of distress that cut through even the drums and the roaring flames. Every dragon in the hall turned to look. Ashrik's eyes were wide with panic, his body trembling violently. He wasn't seeing the ceremony anymore. He was trapped inside his own overwhelming sensory experience, and his mind had moved into pure survival mode. One of the ceremonial guards, not understanding what was happening, stepped forward to steady the prince. He reached out and grabbed Ashrik's shoulder. That touch, unexpected and unwanted, was the final trigger. Ashrik spun and lashed out with his claws. The guard stumbled backward, 3 deep gashes across his chest plate. Another guard rushed forward, and Ashrik met him with a blast of flame, uncontrolled and wild. The second guard's armor protected him, but he was thrown backward by the force. Ashrik's tail whipped around, catching a third guard in the stomach and knocking him to the ground. The hall erupted in chaos. Dragons were shouting. Some moved toward Ashrik to restrain him. Others backed away in shock or disgust. The nobles in the elevated viewing sections hissed their disapproval, and Katie heard the word defective being thrown around like a weapon. She didn't think. She just moved. Katie ran across the ceremonial floor, pushing past dragons who barely noticed the small human. She reached Ashrik just as 4 guards were closing in on him, their weapons drawn. The young prince was backed against a pillar, his mind completely gone to panic, flames flickering at the edges of his mouth as he prepared to defend himself from threats that his overwhelmed brain told him were everywhere. Katie threw herself between Ashrik and the guards. "Stop." Her voice was surprisingly strong for someone so small. "Everyone just stop." The guards hesitated. A human had no authority here, no right to give commands. But something in her voice made them pause. Katie turned her back on them and faced Ashrik. She didn't try to touch him. She kept her distance, knowing that physical contact right now would only make things worse. Instead, she began to sign in the language she had taught him, her hands moving in clear, simple patterns. "Safe," she signed. "You are safe. Breathe with me." Ashrik's wild eyes found her. Recognition flickered there, a small anchor in the storm of his panic. "Breathe," Katie signed again, and she took a slow, exaggerated breath, showing him the pattern. "In. Hold. Out. You can do this." The hole had gone silent. Hundreds of dragons watched as a human woman, barely tall enough to reach Ashrik's chest, faced down the panicking prince with nothing but hand gestures and a calm presence. Slowly, painfully slowly, Ashrik's breathing began to match hers. The flames around his mouth died down. His claws stopped trembling quite so violently. He wasn't calm, not by any measure, but he was coming back from the edge of complete breakdown. That's when Katie turned to face the assembled nobles. Her face was flushed with anger, and when she spoke, her voice carried through the silent hall. "You should be ashamed of yourselves." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Lord Dravik stood up in his viewing box, his voice booming. "How dare you speak to—" "No," Katie cut him off, and the sheer audacity of a human interrupting a dragon lord left him speechless. "How dare you? All of you. You designed this ceremony to be overwhelming. You made it as loud and bright and crowded and chaotic as possible. Then you forced a child who you know struggles with exactly these things to stand in the middle of it all. You set him up to fail, and then you have the nerve to call him defective when he breaks under pressure that you deliberately created." She pointed at the nobles in their elevated seats. "On my world, we learned something. We learned that when a system breaks a person, the problem isn't with the person. It's with the system. You call yourselves an advanced civilization. You have ships that travel between stars. You have technology that can reshape planets. But you can't make simple accommodations for your own prince? Where I come from, that's not wisdom. That's cruelty. That's failure." The hall erupted. Dragons were shouting, some in anger at Katie's insolence, others arguing among themselves. But Katie didn't care about any of them. She only cared about the young prince behind her, who was still shaking but no longer lost in panic. Emperor Vorthan rose from his throne, and the hall fell silent once more. Every eye turned to him. His expression was unreadable, his golden eyes moving from his son to Katie to the assembled nobles. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. "The ceremony is postponed. Everyone will leave. Now." The morning after the disastrous Grand Conclave, Emperor Vorthan summoned his full council to the throne room. The advisors arrived expecting to discuss damage control, perhaps plans to quietly remove Prince Ashrik from the line of succession. Instead, they found themselves facing an emperor whose eyes burned with determination they hadn't seen in years. "I am ordering an imperial investigation," Vorthan announced. "But not into my son's fitness to rule. Into our own traditions and systems." Lord Dravik's jaw dropped. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. The prince's behavior yesterday was a predictable response to an environment designed to overwhelm," Vorthan interrupted, his voice cold as space. "My son is brilliant. He can calculate hyperspace trajectories in his head. He understands quantum mechanics better than most of our scientists. The failure yesterday was not his. It was ours." He turned his gaze to Katie, who stood quietly near the side of the room. "Katie Mitchell, step forward." Katie moved to the center of the hall, very aware of the hostile stares from most of the council members. She kept her head high. "I am appointing you as special advisor on neural diversity," Vorthan declared. "You will have full access to the Imperial archives, medical facilities, and any resources you need. Your authority comes directly from me, and your recommendations will be given serious consideration." The council erupted in protest. A human given such a high position was unheard of. Dravik's voice rose above the others. "This is madness. She is not even dragon. She knows nothing of our ways, our history." "She knows how to help my son," Vorthan said quietly. "Something none of you have managed in 10 years. The appointment stands." Over the next few weeks, Katie dove into the Imperial archives with the determination of someone on a mission. The medical records of the Draconic Imperium went back thousands of years, stored in crystalline data matrices that held more information than entire libraries on Earth. What she found there broke her heart and fueled her anger in equal measure. The patterns were everywhere once she knew what to look for. Throughout dragon history, there had been individuals described with words that translated roughly to differently minded or sensor-divergent. Many of these dragons had shown incredible abilities in specific areas. There was a mathematician from 2,000 years ago who had revolutionized their understanding of dimensional physics but had been removed from his position because he couldn't tolerate the loud environment of the Imperial University. A brilliant engineer who had designed early versions of their faster-than-light drives but was dismissed from service because she couldn't maintain proper eye contact during formal meetings. The records showed genius after genius, lost because they couldn't conform to rigid social standards. Their contributions were footnoted, their struggles labeled as character flaws. Some had been sent away to remote outposts. Others had simply disappeared from records entirely, their potential wasted. Katie compiled her findings into a report that she presented to Emperor Vorthan and his council. She stood before them with a holographic display showing centuries of lost potential. "You've been throwing away some of your best minds," she said bluntly. "These individuals weren't defective. Your systems were failing them. And it's still happening. Right now, across your empire, there are young dragons struggling just like Ashrik, and instead of helping them, you're labeling them as weak and pushing them aside." She pulled up a specific case from 50 years ago. This dragon designed a shield system that could have prevented the disaster at the Kelner shipyards. But he was dismissed from the engineering corps because he had what you called episodes under stress. 1,500 dragons died in that disaster. Died because you valued conformity over capability. The room was silent. Even Lord Dravik had no immediate response. "So what do you propose?" Vorthan asked, though Katie suspected he already supported whatever she was about to say. "We change everything," Katie said. "Starting now." The changes began small but spread quickly. Katie worked with the palace architects to create quiet rooms throughout the Imperial complex. These were spaces with soft lighting, dampened sound, and comfortable furniture where anyone feeling overwhelmed could retreat and recover. At first, only Ashrik used them. Then a young servant was spotted slipping into one during a particularly chaotic feast day. Then a scholar. Then a military officer who everyone thought was unshakable. Katie introduced alternative communication methods as officially recognized and valid. Sign language was taught to palace staff. Written communication was accepted in situations where speaking was traditionally required. Dragons who had struggled for years suddenly found they could participate in ways that worked for their minds. The ceremonial expectations were redesigned with flexibility built in. Important events still happened, but accommodations were offered without shame. Dimmer viewing areas for those sensitive to light. Sound-dampened chambers where people could observe without being in the middle of the chaos. Breaks built into long ceremonies. Permission to leave and return without it being seen as an insult. The resistance was immediate and fierce. The traditionalist houses were outraged. Lord Dravik led the opposition, giving speeches about the contamination of human weakness and the destruction of draconic culture. Several noble families threatened to withdraw their support from the emperor. But Vorthan held firm. When Lord Dravik demanded an audience to formally protest the changes, the emperor listened patiently, then responded with a question. "Tell me, Lord Dravik, do you remember your grandson? The one who was sent to the frontier colonies 5 years ago?" Dravik's expression darkened. "That has nothing to do with. He was brilliant with defensive strategies, wasn't he? Could see patterns in enemy movements that no one else noticed. But he couldn't handle the sensory environment of the War College. So you sent him away rather than admit that maybe the War College was the problem." Dravik said nothing, but his scales had gone pale. "Your grandson is coming back," Vorthan continued. "And he's going to be given the support he needs. You can accept that, or you can retire from court. Choose." Dravik chose to stay. And when his grandson returned and, with proper accommodations, went on to develop new tactical protocols that improved fleet efficiency by 30%, the old lord became significantly quieter in his opposition. Prince Ashrik thrived in ways that seemed almost miraculous to those who had known him before. With the pressure reduced and support systems in place, his natural abilities flourished. He dove deep into advanced physics, spending hours working on problems that fascinated him. The quiet rooms meant he could study without breaking down. The flexible schedule meant he could work during his peak focus times and rest when he needed to. At 13, Ashrik designed a revolutionary modification to their ship propulsion systems. His approach to folding space was completely different from traditional methods, and it worked better. When he presented his designs to the Imperial Engineering Corps, they were stunned. This was the broken prince they had all written off. But perhaps more importantly, other families began coming forward. Quietly at first, then in greater numbers. A merchant house brought their daughter who could barely speak but could analyze trade routes with uncanny accuracy. A military family brought their son who had panic attacks in crowds but could fix any mechanical problem he encountered. An artistic family brought their child who couldn't stand certain textures but could create sculptures so beautiful they made hardened warriors weep. Katie worked with each of them, understanding that every person was different and needed different support. She trained others in her methods, spreading the knowledge across the palace and then across the empire. What had started as a desperate attempt to help one prince was becoming a fundamental shift in how the Draconic Imperium understood minds and potential. Through all of this, Emperor Vorthan watched and learned. He attended Katie's training sessions, asking questions and challenging his own assumptions. He saw how his son blossomed when given the right environment. He saw other young dragons who had been written off begin to contribute in meaningful ways. But he also watched Katie herself. He saw how she worked herself to exhaustion, meeting with families late into the night. He saw how she fought for every child who came to her, facing down prejudice and resistance with a strength that belied her small frame. He saw how she celebrated their victories with genuine joy and how their setbacks hurt her personally. He found himself seeking her company not just for official business but for conversation. They would talk in the palace gardens after her work was done, discussing philosophy and ethics and the nature of civilization. Katie challenged his thinking in ways no advisor ever had. She made him laugh, something he hadn't done genuinely since his mate died. She made him feel alive again. Vorthan began to realize that what he felt wasn't just gratitude or respect. The warmth in his chest when he saw her wasn't just appreciation for what she had done for Ashrik. He was falling in love with this stubborn, brilliant, compassionate human who had turned his world upside down and made it better. But he said nothing. Katie was mortal, human, with a lifespan that would pass in what felt like a moment to him. She was his employee, in a position of less power. And he was an emperor who had already lost one love. The fear of losing another kept him silent. He contacted the loyal guards first, the ones who had been using his network because they appreciated the option for quiet communication. He gave them precise instructions on where to position themselves, creating defensive choke points that made the rebels' numerical advantage meaningless. He reached out to the palace staff, many of whom had benefited from the changes Katie had implemented. They became his eyes and ears, reporting enemy positions through the network. Ashrik calculated everything. Timing, positions, resources. He directed loyal forces with the precision of a master strategist, seeing patterns in the chaos that no one else could perceive. Katie watched in awe as this 13-year-old prince, who couldn't handle loud noises or unexpected touch, calmly outmaneuvered a military coup. When Emperor Vorthan's flagship arrived and his forces stormed the palace, they found the rebellion already collapsing. Ashrik had held them off for 6 hours and was systematically dismantling their positions. The prince had even managed to trap the rebel leadership in the throne room, cutting off their escape routes one by one. Vorthan entered his palace to find his son standing before the throne, Katie at his side, and Lord Cross kneeling with his wrists bound. The young prince looked exhausted but stood tall. He had defended his home, his father's throne, and the changes that had given him and others like him a chance at a real life. The emperor approached his son and did something very UN dragon-like. He knelt down to Ashrik's level, placed a claw gently on his shoulder in the way Katie had taught him the prince could tolerate, and spoke softly. I am proud of you. Not because you defended the palace, though that was remarkable. I am proud because you are exactly who you are, and you have never let anyone convince you to be less than that. In the days that followed, the coup leaders were dealt with. Some were exiled. Others were stripped of their titles. Lord Dravik, who had known about the coup but not directly participated, was forced into retirement. The traditionalist faction lost much of its power, and the reforms Katie had started became permanent imperial policy. But for Vorthan, something else had crystallized during those terrifying hours when his son and the woman he loved were in danger. Life was short, even for dragons. And love, real love, was too rare to waste out of fear. 2 weeks after the coup, Vorthan called an assembly of the full court. Everyone expected announcements about security changes or perhaps new honors for those who had defended the palace. Instead, the emperor stood before them and did something unprecedented in 3,000 years of imperial history. I have an announcement of a personal nature, he began. Katie Mitchell, please step forward. Katie, standing with the other advisors, felt her heart start to race. She moved to stand before the throne, aware of hundreds of eyes on her. Vorthen descended from his throne to stand beside her. He was enormous compared to her small human frame, but he lowered his head to bring his eyes closer to her level. You came to this palace as a tribute, a servant from a conquered world, he said. You stayed because you saw my son not as broken, but as brilliant. You changed our empire, challenged our assumptions, and made us better. You saved my son's life. And somewhere in all of that, you did something I thought impossible. You made me want to live again, not just exist. Katie's eyes went wide. Around the hall, she could hear the whispers starting. I am asking you, Vorthen continued, not as emperor to subject, but as one person to another, would you consider being my partner? Not my servant or advisor, but my equal? Would you help me raise Ashrik and lead this empire together? The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. A human? As imperial consort? It was unthinkable. Katie stood very still, her mind racing. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear enough to carry through the suddenly silent hall. I need to know something first, she said. I'm human. I'll be old in 30 years. I'll be dead in maybe 60 if I'm lucky. You'll live for centuries after I'm gone. Are you really ready for that? To love someone you'll lose so quickly? Vorthen's expression softened in a way that made him look younger, almost vulnerable. I have already lost one mate. It nearly destroyed me. The fear of that pain again has kept my heart locked away for 3 years. But watching you with my son, seeing your courage, feeling alive when I talk to you, I realized something. The pain of loss is the price we pay for love. And love, even temporary love, is worth that price. And the other thing, Katie continued, her voice stronger now. I need to know you see me as me. Not just as the person who helped your son. Not just as someone useful. Do you see Katie? The stubborn woman who argues with you about philosophy at midnight? The person who can't sing but hums anyway? The human who puts hot sauce on everything and makes terrible jokes? Vorthen's laugh was warm and genuine. I see you. I see the woman who threw herself between my son and armed guards. I see the person who challenges me when I'm wrong and celebrates with me when things go right. I see someone who makes me want to be better. I see Katie, and I love her. Katie felt tears starting to form. She had not let herself hope for this, had not let herself even think about the feelings that had been growing in her own chest. But now, with this massive dragon emperor kneeling before her in front of his entire court, declaring his love. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll stand beside you. For however long I have. The hall exploded in sound. Some dragons were cheering. Others were protesting. But Katie didn't care about any of them. She only cared about the emperor whose eyes shone with joy, and about the young prince who was signing enthusiastically from the side of the room, the dragon equivalent of a huge smile on his face. Prince Ashrik pushed through the crowd to reach them. He looked at his father, then at Katie, then signed something that made both of them laugh. I told you that you liked each other. Nobody listened to me. And so began a new chapter in the Draconic Imperium. An empire that learned that difference was not weakness, that accommodation was not coddling, and that sometimes the most profound changes come from the most unexpected sources. An empire led by a dragon emperor, a human woman, and a prince who everyone had once called broken but who proved to be exactly the leader they needed. Katie knew her time would be short compared to the centuries dragons lived. But she also knew that the impact of even a short life could echo for generations. She had already proven that. And now, with Vorthen beside her and Ashrik growing into the remarkable leader he was always meant to be, she was ready to make every one of her remaining years count. The quiet revolution that started with one overwhelmed prince in a dark room had transformed an empire. And it had given a lonely emperor and a determined human woman a chance at something neither had expected to find again. Love. Partnership. Family. Hope. The things that matter most, regardless of how long they last.